I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker of the day. It's Brendan O'Dwyer. Brendan is a professor of accounting at the University of Amsterdam. He's also a professor of accounting at the Alliance Manchester Business School, and further on also a visiting professor at the University of Sydney's Business School. Brendan has published extensively in leading international academic journals in the areas of non-financial reporting, financial and non-financial assurance, corporate and NGO accountability, sustainability reporting and assurance, and also the regulations of professions. Brendan is a recipient of many rewards. In 2019, he received the Accounting, Auditing and Accountability Journal Interdisciplinary Accounting Research Hall of Fame Award in the recognition of his distinguished contribution to the progress of interdisciplinary accounting research. So these days, Brendan is active in doing research on climate change and the role of accounting, how accounting can capture climate risks, and how actors can make informed decisions based on this information. This area of research resonates very much with the theme of this forum, and it's also what Brendan will talk about today. I'm very happy to welcome you, Brendan, and the floor is yours. The title of your talk is The Quest for Globally Consistent and Comparable Corporate Reporting on Climate Change Risks. So please, Brendan.
Thank you, Torkel. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Torkel, for a very kind introduction. As Torkel has just outlined, my title is The Quest for Consistent and Comparable Corporate Reporting on Climate Change Risks. I have around 35 to 40 minutes to speak to you. If I had 35 to 40 hours, it probably would not be enough, given the amount of developments that have occurred in this particular area just in the past year alone. So before I outline to you a broad framework for my conversation with you this morning, I'll just reflect somewhat on the focus I'm going to take with respect to considering this particular issue in the context of the recent developments that have occurred in Europe and in the broader international context in the past year alone. I'm a professor of accounting, so I'll start with the accountants. And we had just around a year ago the release of the IFRS Foundation's consultation paper on sustainability reporting, where they have come up with a view that we should have an international sustainability standards board, which seeks to provide us with consistent and comparable climate change reporting or climate risk reporting in the context of a broader realm of sustainability reporting. Now, they have a particular view and a focus in this particular set of proposals on the investor and the investor decision-making needs. However, to form this board, they're going to need to change their constitution, and they're well on the way to doing that. And they hope to announce formally the board and its existence and its composition at the upcoming COP26 at the end of this month. Now, this is a particularly interesting development because it occurs on top of a suite of major developments that have occurred in the past 2 or 3 years in this particular area from a variety of different bodies. But the IFRS Foundation's development is intriguing because it has managed to get a lot of support from very powerful entities. It hasn't got quite a recommendation yet from IOSCO, but they have welcomed it in general. And it's also coming at a time when bodies like the SEC are looking for information and also looking for some consultation on their issues around climate change disclosure, again in the context of information focused on investors. So that's the accountants moving into this realm. Now, at the same time, here in the European context, we have a development whereby the EU Commission has updated its non-financial reporting directive. And there's been a massive work occurring in this area in publications in the past 5 or 6 months alone. And what they're claiming to do or trying to do is produce a set of sustainability reporting standards within which climate risk reporting will be central. And they're moving along at an absolutely crazy pace, in that they want to have a first set of standards by mid-2022. Now, in the midst of all of this, you have the IFRS Foundation saying they're going to focus initially on climate risk in their reporting recommendations. And that's also central to what the EU Commission is doing. Both of these developments are drawing on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures recommendations, which were released in 2017. This is a private sector body which is set up by the Financial Stability Board under the auspices of the G20 and with the very vocal and public support of Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg. So they're drawing very much on the TCFD in this. Now, what I've been doing for the past 7 or 8 months is interviewing people in all of these bodies, TCFD members, individuals involved in the investment community and climate risk reporting, lots of different preparers and users, and bodies like Climate Action 100 Plus and the IAIG, who are supporting an investor-focused conception of climate risk reporting. I'm going to, in my presentation, just draw on some of the reflections that have been issued to me in many of these conversations. But we should bear in mind that in this context, there is a regulatory space rapidly developing, particularly in the European context. The IFRS Foundation positions itself as highly global, with a focus on what they call, initially at least, the investor, often dubbed the view of the companies being impacted by climate change. The EU Commission's approach is what they call a double materiality approach, focusing on a company's impact on climate and also climate impact on the company. That's a very simplistic conceptualization. But this regulatory space is being driven a lot at the EU Commission level by their EU taxonomy, which offers a classification system for sustainable activities. And that has, in a sense, then driven 2 major developments this year. First of all, their Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is requiring mandatory ESG disclosure obligations for asset managers and other financial market participants. And also, this has been embedded within their Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is the update of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. They have a proposal out at the moment. And just a month ago, they released a climate standard prototype working paper, which indicates the nature of the standardization of climate risk reporting they might expect. Now, this particular slide is a complete mess right now, and that's deliberate, because this whole realm is full of a suite of players. And I had mentioned many of the key players who've had a major impact in this area in the past 20 years, like the GRI, bodies in the Value Reporting Foundation, the IARC, and SASB, etc., who are all feeding into many of these developments as well. Now, I'm going to come back to these developments when I reflect on the perceptions of the people I've interviewed in the past 9 months. But the point I'm making to you here is this is an absolutely phenomenally complex area. And the essence of these bodies, what they're trying to do is to simplify it and to make it more manageable, both for preparers and for users, whoever they might be. Coming back to this notion of providing consistent and comparable reporting. Now, I'm going to focus somewhat on the TCFD in the initial part of the presentation, and then move out to some broader issues around the developments in this climate risk reporting area. And one of my key themes is going to be the idea of organizing dissonance in this area, because there is quite a lot of dissonance in the area in general in development. There are different value frames attached to climate risk reporting and its objectives generally, and also to different forms of climate risk reporting. And it's very important that this dissonance becomes productive, in that we do reach some sort of agreement on what we deem to be climate change reporting that we can all be happy with. So I'm first of all going to outline some of the complexities underpinning the development of this form of reporting by delving inside the TCFD deliberations on their recommendations when they were going about trying to come about with a set of recommendations. And this will elaborate on the complexities in this area and the issues that need to be dealt with. I'll then talk briefly about the 2 developments I've mentioned a moment ago, the EU Commission development and the IFRS Foundation development, just to give you a sense as to the issues that are arising in that context that will need to be addressed and managed if we're going to get to the holy grail that people want of this consistent and comparable reporting, if indeed that holy grail is ever possible. And then I'm going to delve into issues, particular issues that interviewees brought up in my conversations with them that cause some dissonance. The 80-20 mantra is one, whereby there's this debate about whether we're looking for quality or quantity of disclosure, particularly as there is a desire to, in some way, grapple with the overall systemic risks arising from climate change that can be in some way facilitated by broader and more consistent and comparable reporting. But do we want broader reporting, or do we want better quality reporting in the current domain? I'm also going to talk briefly about the quest for standardization and whether in fact this is advisable or achievable or not, and then move on to the issue of materiality briefly. Materiality is an issue I could talk about again for quite some time because it's been quite controversial in this area. I'm then going to speak about one particular type of disclosure which is pushed quite a lot by the TCFD and is making its way into other recommendations as well, and that's disclosure of scenario analyses. This is analysis of the resilience of companies' strategies with respect to various climate scenarios that may occur way into the future, and how this is becoming a central innovative mechanism in the context of this reporting, but it's also creating dissonance that will need to be organized. I'll then finally speak briefly about auditability, about the nature of the information and how, in fact, it may well need to be amenable to audit in the future. And I'll reflect very briefly on the nature of reporting as it currently exists in practice, given all of these issues. Let's just start briefly then with reflecting on the TCFD's framework. This is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. A broad way of underpinning their objectives would be to state they want to understand the financial sector's exposures to climate risks. And theirs is very much a principles-based framework, using these four broad elements to underpin reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities. So we have the governance, strategy, and risk management of companies, and then we bring ourselves down to the issue of metrics and targets. And again, the process through which these set of recommendations was produced is something I've been studying in quite a lot of detail in the past while. I'm going to elaborate on some elements of that process in a moment to make you realize how complex the issues might be in this area. Now, the TCFD is very focused on the investor, of course, and on seeking the financial impacts, excuse me, of climate change on companies. And it looks at risks and opportunities, seeks out financial impact, and then wants to associate those financial impacts within the financial statements, our traditional financial statements we deal with. Now, their focus is on the financial statements in particular, whereas the IFRS Foundation is looking at the impact of climate change on enterprise value, which is a different concept, as we all know, but there are so many overlaps here. The TCFD has rather seamlessly segued into the IFRS Foundation's aims and ambitions. Now, the TCFD has been lauded for its contribution, and it is so in the interviews I've had as well, particularly for waking up the investment community. Now, many who might be viewing this particular presentation in the investment community might debate that fact, but this is a claim that's made by many in the domain I've been interviewing. The sense that Climate Action 100 Plus came along around the same time, and now we have this tsunami of investment interest and bodies pushing for more disclosure and better disclosure on climate risks. It's also stimulated organizations to come together in a form of competition, whereby they're coming together to understand how they can report and deal with these risks better, particularly in areas like scenario analysis, and being facilitated by bodies like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, among others. Many claim too that the TCFD has had the unintended consequence of structuring what many refer to as a reporting mess, of getting many of the bodies, the many highly dedicated, original, and in fact highly influential bodies together to come up with some sort of consistent and comparable focus on the area of climate-related disclosures, particularly of a financial nature. An example would be the publication last year by CDP, CDSB, GRI, IIRC, and SASB with their prototype climate-related financial disclosure standard. I apologize for the number of acronyms that I'm using. I'm not going to spell them all out to you, unfortunately, in the interest of time and flow. That's another positive contribution. But more interestingly, from my perspective, is the fact that many people, particularly in the TCFD, have said to me, Brendan, we are business working for regulators. We are creating the space to enable the regulators to move in and regulate in this area. And that's actually something which is borne up by much evidence, given the fact that TCFD has made its way into regulations in various contexts, both within stock exchanges and also other disclosure regulations worldwide. And that's only beginning. And of course, the idea that the focus on financial disclosure, the focus on investors, and the significant support from high-profile individuals like Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, using a combination of social and economic resources to push this, has been quite influential. But in this context also, we have something healthy. The TCFD's legitimacy is also somewhat contested. Yes, it's legitimized climate risk disclosures for investors, many claim, but its remit for some is contestable, given that it's a private sector, privately funded organization in the main. Some have said in interviews that TCFD is not very much an advance on the non-financial reporting disclosure regulation. It adds in scenario analysis, and then that's all. Others have commented that the due process and governance in the TCFD is not transparent enough, that it's too driven by one private sector actor in the form of Bloomberg. And these are all issues around the TCFD and its emergence, and they're understandable, because the TCFD has entered quite a contested domain and has sought to, in some way, create a space for itself and create some cohesion and coherence and consistency in that domain. But this is the sort of dissonance I'm talking about that is going to need to be managed as climate risk reporting moves forward. But to understand the TCFD a bit better and the challenges that are being faced, it's worthwhile looking inside the organization itself and just seeking out how they managed to come up with this particular set of recommendations. Yes, the TCFD is a child of the G20 and the Financial Stability Board, but even in there's dissonance around, or was when it was formed, around climate change, the nature of climate change, the way it should be reported or embraced. And initially, when the TCFD began, there was reticence from major sectors like oil and gas, for example. There were concerns that TCFD should not even exist. Its timing was also troublesome, given the political environment it entered, or the political environment that evolved as it was beginning, particularly with the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So it hasn't had an easy ride to come through with its recommendations. And remember, it's bringing together preparers of different types, users of different types, industries, regions, and sometimes legal frameworks which simply do not align. So it's a global initiative with all the complexities that brings with it. So in essence, within the TCFD, an admirable role played by the members and those looking at it has been to balance the technical aspects of producing recommendations with the political elements that need to be managed, the big and the small p in this context. And this has meant that the role of the key coordinators, like the Michael Bloombergs, the Mary Shapiros, and others, like Mark Carney, has been hugely important in pushing this. So it's an incredibly complex and challenging process just to get to the stage they've got to. Now, in the context of getting there, they've produced a very broad set of flexible recommendations. But within that process, there was dissonance also. The scope set by the Financial Stability Board was quite tight deliberately. This is a task force, and it was mimicked on the EDTF. But within the task force, there were debates about that scope, concerns about that scope, and also very constructive conversations around how to resolve these issues. The issue of materiality I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of how it should be defined, if at all, in this context was important. What is material climate risk and opportunity information? How do we define or guide companies on materiality? Created tumultuous debates within this particular body. Also, you've got this mix, the users and the preparers. So when trying to negotiate around disclosures, users may well have demanded lots of disclosure of certain types. But remember, in this context, users like investment funds and other intermediaries in the investment world are now also going to be preparers. So that dynamic has also influenced a lot of the final recommendations as well. And it's one that causes pause within the user community, because you ask for something, you may well also have to provide that in your own disclosure. And scenario analysis, as I mentioned earlier, became a very important factor in this particular process as well. It became the added value that was produced by the TCFD. And I'm going to talk a bit more about scenario analysis later. But again, not a straightforward process, imbued with dissonance, imbued with lots of debate and argument to come up with what was produced in the end. But I would argue, given the study I've done, I'm currently writing on this, that the frictions within the TCFD were productive. The dissonance was organized in a manner which allowed them to come up with a set of recommendations that could be broadly acceptable. Whether that leads to consistent and comparable reporting in the area of climate change risk and opportunities, we will have to wait and see. So let's move back to the beginning of the presentation for a moment, to the EU Commission and the IFRS Foundation. Again, here we see incredible effort, really strong individuals involved in pushing forward this agenda to try and produce standardized climate risk reporting. In the midst of this, we also have dissonance emerging. It's healthy dissonance. The CSRD's ambitions, it's said by some interviews, will not be curtailed by the IFRS Foundation. People state the IFRS Foundation has no legal mandate, unlike the EU Commission. Others state that the thought that Europe should set standards that will then be propagated worldwide is dismissed outright. Key industries in Europe will be in trouble, some people say. This is global. Don't go ahead. Don't push ahead of the IFRS Foundation. Wait, and in some ways see what's going to happen. We need global solutions, global comparability, not a European variant and a US variant. We need a single language if we want to truly address this. So again, these are quotations from many of my interviewees, concerned that perhaps we need to have more cohesion between the regulatory issue at the public level, the EU Commission, and at the private level, the IFRS Foundation. But there are conversations going on in the background to try and organize any dissonance that might be emerging there. But it will need to be addressed. Let's look more specifically at some of the issues then that are causing dissonance with respect to the actual nature of climate risk reporting itself. The 80-20 mantra is used quite a lot to argue that we should be pushing for more disclosure by more organizations, as opposed to trying to make the really good disclosures even better. We want to bring people in and avoid islands of impact, it's claimed. The perfect is the enemy of the good. We want to start conversations. Stop trying to encourage the best companies to get better, get those who are not engaging to engage, so we have more information, so we can get a better sense of stability risks. Let's respect diversity of corporations. Let's get to the 50% line globally rather than completely detailed reporting frameworks. So this is the reflection of debates that have occurred between preparers and users within the TCFD itself, but also more broadly in this reporting environment. And so the idea then in promoting the broader form of principles-based reporting is to offer signals, not serenity. Don't make the user feel serene. Don't offer to make the user feel serene. Realize that you're going to just send signals. Here's a quote from a major user of this reporting and talking about scope 3 reporting in this area. And it's informative of a user view, which doesn't suggest they want absolute, precise, reliable probably is the wrong word, but more comparable information. He's talking about a major bank. They provide a scope 3 analysis. If you look at it, you can shoot 1,000 holes in the bank's report. You can say, oh, this is such a bad report. Actually, we think it's great. The numbers could be off by more than a power of 10. But it shows that the company is developing its perspective. It's sticking its head out to experiment with a full scope 3 analysis. So you can see here, there are even major users who are in favor of allowing companies to move in gently into this form of reporting and experiment. And that moves away from the mania some talk about towards very precise metrics in this area, which may well be necessary. The TCFD had their own debates on this internally and then came up with this broad set of principles with suggested metrics, allowing a certain amount of flexibility. Now, there is also user pushback. This user I've given you here is not necessarily representative of all users of this information. Others, particularly in the responsible investment area, want better disclosure. They want more reliable, consistent, comparable disclosure, and they will say we cannot wait. We can't wait until we get to a situation whereby we have these companies up to speed in this particular area. That's one area of dissonance around reporting. Another area is standardization. Can we have Flexibility for companies and the focus on industry sectors is a very common approach. But even can we have flexibility within the sectors of reporting while also having comparability? And that is going to be the key issue that needs to be addressed in much of the deliberations that are currently taking place. This quotation here comes from somebody linked to the TCFD about the constant push to standardize. This person mentions the first 6 months was spent on what he refers to as a pointless quest for the one magical climate change metric which will proxy for risk for every single company in every single sector around the world. This idea that we have to get away from this notion that we can standardize everything. So this opens up this desire for principles which the TCFD satisfied to move towards more meaningful metrics that do allow for flexibility and context. As one interviewee said to me, too much prescriptiveness is a trap for the whole climate reporting discussion. Because it took 30 years, of course, to bring this to the fore, people believe they now have a secret sauce. And that's something many are saying we should be careful about. But IOSCO, in their publication welcoming the IFRS Foundation, spoke about standardizing narrative disclosures. That may well cause some alarm among many of the individuals I'm citing here in this area of standardization. So flexibility and comparability. Is this possible within the standardization debate is something which is being thought about and is causing a certain level of dissonance. However, despite this, the TCFD has made a great effort to actually try and offer some cross-industry metrics that are comparable. So moving away from just the industry focus. And it's interesting to look at some of these. For example, the carbon prices, which are still quite controversial, are being called for by all companies in terms of disclosure by the TCFD. The units of measure for cross-industry metrics mix percentages and also currencies. So you have these different measures being used. And also central to these recommended disclosures is the issue of materiality. Scope 3, if relevant and material. Proportion of assets, financing activities materially exposed to physical risks. Material is an essential issue in this area. What is material? What does it mean? And how is it going to be addressed in a manner which creates some sense of comparability and consistency? So it's worth reflecting on that for a moment. Now, there are intense debates around the issue of materiality in this area. Incredibly intense debates around issues around double materiality, single materiality, reporting for investors, for broader stakeholders, reporting on impacts of the company versus impacts by the company. Versus impacts created by the company. But these debates are ongoing, and they're very healthy debates. But in the context of my interviews, in particular with respect to financial related climate risk disclosures, many individuals were saying, Brendan, I'm concerned that materiality, in terms of defining it precisely, is not really applicable at a global level. It's a cultural and a legal concept. If you're going to put these disclosures into financial filings, you're then subject to whatever laws regulate financial filings in different jurisdictions. This very much focuses on materiality in the context of investors. So it's not just about investors and broader stakeholders, it's also about the notion of materiality, even when you focus down on investors alone. Time horizons create difficulties for companies in the context of materiality. As one interviewee said to me, if you go back 5 or 6 years, there was certainly a substantive body of opinion that said material means it's going to affect the financial balance sheet within the next 6 months or 1 year. So how can climate change that is going to evolve over the next 30 years be material in that sense? These are the reflections individuals are actually having. With the TCFD, they came up with no definition, effectively. A sort of constructive ambiguity around materiality because of these global issues and because of the dissonance in this particular area. However, companies are engaging in materiality assessments outside of those related to financial filings and have been for years. This is a citation from a recent WBCSD report. The clear majority of WBCSD members undertake materiality assessments that consider stakeholder inputs. So there is something happening and has been happening for years in this area around materiality. So the issue is not just about this so-called double or single materiality. Even when you get to so-called single materiality, you've got to consider then how you're going to define, if you're going to define materiality, this essentially qualitative concept. And then scenario analysis, which, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the key reporting recommendations of the TCFD. And scenario analysis is a form of reporting which emphasizes organizations indicating the resilience of their strategies to a series of different climate-related scenarios, including 2 degrees Celsius or lower in that context. But scenarios are hypothetical constructs. So I'm a financial accounting lecturer and professor. If somebody comes to me and says, Brendan, I want a standard that allows me to report clearly and consistently on a hypothetical construct, it's going to cause me alarm. But they are, that's what they are. They're not forecasts, they're not predictions, they're not sensitivity analyses, they're hypothetical. So in a sense, you're going from back testing to forward testing. You're moving from risks to broad-based uncertainties, which means you're moving from probability to plausibility. And finally, and for some more shocking, my slides have gone back. Bear with me, the speed. And so more shockingly, we have this idea that we're moving from precision to perception. Uncertainty, plausibility, and perception. Quite shocking in lots of respects if you're trying to produce some consistent comparable reporting. So scenario analysis reporting then is deemed to be a signaling device. It can only operate, many claim, as a conversation starter. And many users have said even a bad scenario analysis may be helpful and instrumental in creating a dialogue with companies. And remember as well, in financial reporting, we have forward-looking information already. It's already widely used, for example, in fair value measurement, the measurement of provisions, and the recognition of contingent liabilities. But we have issues of complexity and confidentiality, even though the TCFD has warned that confidentiality is not a particularly suitable claim to make if you don't want to engage in scenario analysis. But some are quite adamant. It's irresponsible speculation, they've said to me, going beyond 5 years. In my work, one CEO said, I don't look beyond 5 years. Within the TCFD, there was a push for a standard scenario, again for a magic metric, and that was pushed back. So scenario analysis then is about asking questions and not necessarily providing answers. The concern with it is because of this uncertainty, this focus on plausibility, and this focus on perception, that no one will do it properly. It's scary. It can be a door closer. So the TCFD has recommended that we start with stories. We start with narrative. We make them logical. We make them coherent. And then we move towards greater sophistication if that's indeed possible. Even if we do this, many of the preparers I've spoken to have said to me, Brendan, many of the users are seeing my scenario analyses as forecasts. As one individual said to me, I'm fed up with investors confusing scenarios and forecasts. So there's a lot of issues around communication here, a lot of issues around addressing scenario analysis here that will need to be looked at very carefully and are being looked at very carefully. If you see this suite of consultations that have been occurring in the past 4 or 5 years among industry sectors in this particular area. So given these concerns and given these questions, the TCFD and other bodies like WBCSD have been active in helping companies to understand how to grapple with scenario analysis reporting. But there is a concern, and even from members of the TCFD I've spoken to, that this may be now becoming too quickly and too excessively complex. In that the idea initially was not to create complexity, to allow companies to engage with this in a manner that was somewhat reliable, provided clear signaling, but did not become overly technical. And I'm probably one of the few people who have read this document in front of you, their guidance on scenario analysis from the TCFD. And you can see the level of depth and detail now that companies are going into just to address this form of reporting. And again, the dissonance here around the value attached to this form of reporting is going to need to be managed. The final point I want to make then is on auditability of climate risk reporting. Within the corporate sustainability reporting developments, they are stating they will require assurance on the broader sustainability reporting, which will include climate risk reporting. Now, this is going to be a progressive approach. We will have a limited assurance for the time being, and then we're going to try and get standards in the area of assurance, and finally have a legal requirement given those standards for reasonable and not limited assurance in this area. That's a big ambition, but it also ignores masses of work which has occurred in the broader sustainability assurance area in the past 15 to 20 years, which has shown how many firms, particularly Big Four firms, have grappled with providing reasonable assurance and the issues involved in doing so. So again, there's a big risk here of reinventing wheels in this area. And one might think, is reasonable assurance desirable? Yes, in this area. Is it realistic? That remains to be seen. There are complexities in auditability. Think of scenario analysis. I talked earlier about resilience. How do you provide assurance on resilience disclosure? How do I assure on hypothetical constructs? It's difficult enough to construct them. How do I actually audit them? How do I indicate whether a scenario analysis is plausible, distinctive, consistent, relevant, and challenging as an auditor? Am I willing to do that? Do users actually want this? Organizations are also going to make materiality assessments of climate risks. As an auditor, I will have to assure those assessments. Are they complete in their reporting on climate risks? That's something that's going to cause a lot of consternation, I would argue. Is there a role for shareholder and stakeholder engagement in these assurance processes? Will users come in and determine what they believe to be material? Preparers might feel some concern about this, and then indicate to assurers what they want the assurance on. This has happened in the area of sustainability assurance in the past 15 years, where reasonable assurance was being provided. And should auditability be driving climate risk reporting? The IFRS Foundation states they want reporting which is capable of being assured. Will this limit the nature of reporting? Will this cause the reporting to be less useful to the users, be they investors or broader stakeholder groups? Is auditability really a criteria to drive climate risk reporting? And if this issue of auditability interests you, you should follow Misum very carefully, because their excellent researchers are looking into this particular issue at the moment in the context of the TCFD. So where are we at then with reporting? Well, if you look at the recent report by Carbon Tracker, if you look at recent report by the combination of Frank Bold and the Alliance for Corporate Transparency on the implementation of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and if you look at last year's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Status Report, you wouldn't be overly optimistic or excited about where reporting is going. And let's just take an example, the TCFD status report from last year. We can see here that we have an increase over the period 2017 to 2019 in the governance disclosures, but it's 24% of the sample are reporting. Take a look down at the resilience of strategy reporting. That's the scenario analysis I've been talking about. 4, 5 to 7% from 2017 to 2019. That's where the issue is right now. And members of Misum are looking into this too in the context of why this might be happening. As one member of the TCFD said to me, Brendan, I'm happy with the endorsement of the TCFD. It's wonderful. It's been powerful. I'm less happy with the substantive uptake. In the interest of time, I won't go through the other 2 reports I have which tell a similar story. I will just briefly conclude. So in this particular area then, we have major developments occurring simultaneously, which need to feed into each other. We have various groups merging, coalescing, and coming together to help with the process of producing this consistent and comparable reporting. The key to all of this is to organize any frictions here in a productive manner, to make sure any of this dissonance gets managed in a manner that leads us towards a system that we can be reliable, but also allow us to get better disclosure. I think what's going to happen is eventually that disclosure is going to have to be used just to deepen engagements between users and companies. Yes, many want clear, concise metrics like the WEF initiative last year. Are these going to close down debate, open up debate? Are they going to improve the nature of the reflection of performance of companies in financial reports and other reports? I don't know. I would say we need to be aware of overly standardized thinking. Yes, standardization is a goal, comparability and consistency are essential, absolutely essential. But we're going to have, paradoxically, to embed flexibility within that and to embrace overall limits to comparability and consistency in this particular area. It's a very dynamic, incredibly fascinating area right now to be involved in as a researcher like I am, but also I think for many people viewing who are operating in this area in practice. But also the next year to 18 months are going to be something to watch very carefully to see if we do get any closer to the ideals which are being espoused by these various organizations. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Brennan. Super interesting. We have a number of questions that we could start off with. A first one, perhaps, if you could elaborate a little bit about why we are talking about TCFD. Could we have been talking about something else? Why have TCFD gained such momentum?
Well, one reason we're talking about TCFD is because I've been studying them, so I apologize for that, number one. The second reason is the TCFD have gained their momentum for a number of reasons. It's an incredibly powerfully supported group. It's come from a recommendation from the G20, spread through the Financial Stability Board, and then has brought together individuals like Mary Shapiro, like Michael Bloomberg, and of course had the support of Mark Carney with his very now very famous speech in London in 2015 when he announced its launch. So that powerful social network and the economic resources which Bloomberg in particular have put into this have been very important. That's been huge. But I think we can't also ignore the interest of individuals like Mark Carney in pushing this. And having looked at this from the inside, the level of commitment and momentum from individuals quite shocked me in terms of how they dealt with the various issues they had to deal with. And a number of them were not simple issues of dissonance, and then kept pushing forward. And yes, I deliberately put that slide up as well to indicate, yes, there is pushback. There are individuals and organizations who have concerns about this. But I think in that broader ecosystem, the TCFD has provided a powerful ledge for people to hang on to, particularly in climate risk reporting. And remember, it's a task force. It should be gone by now. It should be gone by now. Task forces have a limited lifespan, but as many of the members have said to me, Brendan, this lifespan looks like it's going to be my entire life, the way things are going. But so they're the main reasons for that. But all of these organizations, and everyone knows this, SASB's, GRIs, they've got brilliant people involved, highly dedicated people, and they're all interacting. And they will produce something, I think, in the next year or two.
Interesting. So it's a task force for climate-related financial disclosures, but it seems to be very little financial disclosures so far. I mean, the scenario analysis is very much lagging behind. What kind of mechanisms are you thinking about that can explain this?
Well, I think it'll be very interesting to see what the IFRS Foundation comes up with in this context, given that they are our financial reporting standard setters. And bodies like IFAC and the IASB have been producing documentation and indicators showing exactly where climate risk fits into conventional financial reporting in areas, around provisions, etc., contingent liabilities, and that particular area. But the reason that TCFD might not be as focused on narrow financial reporting as you suggest is the nature of the process. Think of the composition of that, the global composition, the composition of preparers and different users. It is going to be, I wouldn't call it a compromise, because people have walked away from that table not entirely satisfied. That's why I talk about dissonance. You have your value frame, You don't necessarily compromise on that, but you have to come up with something. And they've come up with the best they possibly can. But their idea is essentially to get the ball rolling, to get people engaged. And now the IFRS Foundation has come on, and a lot of other bodies are engaging in this. But for me, the interesting thing about the TCFD is the way it's managed to permeate many of the initiatives which are emerging at the moment. And initiatives which may be in some ways going in slightly different directions with respect to their focus in the area of climate risk and opportunity reporting.
Interesting. I question from the audience here. Do you think TCFD reporting should be mandatory? And how do we increase the incentives for firms and businesses to do TCFD reporting on climate risks?
Well, TCFD reporting is being made mandatory in many locations. I mean, if you want to be a prime listing on the London Stock Exchange, you need to be complying or explaining with TCFD reporting. Do I think it should be regulatory? Well, I'm very cautious about offering my particular view. I think on balance, yes. But what intrigued me in the interviews I conducted was the amount of highly market-driven individuals who were in this whole domain, who actually said to me clearly, Brendan, yeah, this needs to be regulated in the future. We are a private sector entity. We are, okay, we're working on behalf of a quasi-regulator, but in order for this to gain traction, in order for it to actually push, we are going to have regulation. But I mean, it's very easy to say, let's have regulation. It's the nature of the regulation that's important. And the TCFD is going to become part of regulation indirectly because it's embedded in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And that's one of the points I'm trying to make. It's making its way in. You know, it stands alone, but now it's seguing in. And even if you look at the technical task force, which the IFRS Foundation has recently set up, you know, there are individuals. One of the key drivers of the TCFD, Curtis Ravenel from Bloomberg, is in there as well, and he's an absolute expert in this particular area. So it's indirectly becoming regulated, and becoming part of regulation. But overall, I think, yes, regulation is probably regulation with some element of flexibility built in. That's the most important thing, not regulation which is overly restrictive.
But still also, I mean, if you look at the compliance so far when it comes to scenario analysis, it's very, on a very low level. And I really like the way you described it as embracing uncertainty. That might be the intention from the design side, so to speak. But the expectations from the investor side might be that this is a tool for them to plug into their spreadsheets.
That's true. If that's the case, then they're likely to be disappointed in the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation, scenario analysis for many is about signaling. It's about creating a sense that you are actually addressing the issues, that you're actually thinking about them, and you're actually willing to, in some way, expose yourself. And an example is given in the Scope 3 quotation I gave you, where the user I spoke to said, I'm not that particularly concerned about the precision right now. I am concerned about the signal it sends me that they're engaging in this. Now, again, you might be an individual in the investment community who wants to plug in something very quickly, but you want to know about risks on the horizon. If you're a pension fund, you want to know about long-term risk. You want some way of assessing that. You're never going to be able to manage that in a manner that satisfies you. And I'm sorry, if you want that beautiful figure to plug in, it isn't available. You can only rely on signaling devices to get a sense as to whether companies are willing to and considering dealing with these particular issues. And the TCFD has been admirable in the way it's tried to push companies to get together and to try and engage in this competition to come up with a way of dealing with scenario analysis. But remember as well, I must say as well, Torkel, there are lots of companies who are very sophisticated in this area. And one of the members of the TCFD who was sophisticated in this area was able to bring people along with this. But the problem is there are also lots of companies who are scared to death by this issue. But that's not going to, doesn't really answer your question. But my summary answer is you're not going to get that precision that you want.
No, of course. Still, it might also be that, if you are someone that prepares this and you're scared to put yourself out, so to speak, show yourself sensitive or vulnerable for climate risks and how this might be taken up by the investor community, you take one step back and you don't disclose. And perhaps that is...
Yes, and that is what's happening right now. And the TCFD have made it very clear they are not going to be overly tolerant is too strong a word, but tolerant of this excuse. But remember as well, Torkel, these arguments and these debates were also embedded in the process through which the recommendations were produced. So this is what I've been talking about, the dissonance within the TCFD, which has produced these recommendations. So you think of it. You've got a preparer from let's say a German utility, and you have a responsible investor. They've got to come together in this area. So these debates have led to what we have right now.
Yeah. Must also come back to what you also mentioned about audit and auditability of this. How do you audit the future? You mentioned it, and I think that also could be elaborated on, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I think what auditors are going to do with scenario analysis is what they'll say is, okay, we will look at the assumptions the companies make to produce a scenario analysis. We will offer you an opinion on those assumptions, and we will state to you that these assumptions appear reasonable, or do not appear to not be reasonable. That would be a limited assurance opinion initially. But the ambition of the CSRD to push for reasonable assurance in the future is contingent on auditors having these sustainable assurance standards. And it's not an impossible task, but of course there are risk issues here as well involved for auditing firms. And I've done a lot of work on this in the past and published on the processes through which auditing firms have tried to engage with reasonable assurance in the area of sustainability reporting. And the complexities are not to be underestimated, but they're not impossible either. Well, and just one last point, Torkel, that's linked to what you've asked me. The CSRD have also said they want to open out this audit market. They want to make it a market whereby it's not just for the auditors of financial statements. And that's going to be intriguing, because in the history of sustainability reporting assurance, you had a situation whereby young boutique players came in and were offering reasonable assurance quite freely, not worrying about the risks. But bigger entities like the Big Four were asking themselves, how on earth can those opinions be given the risks involved and the threats that are involved with respect to litigation? So this could be repeated in this context.
Very good. One last question. So, this is task force. It should be gone by now, as you said. But what will happen how will it look in 2 to 3 years? Where are we then?
I think the task force will still exist in 2 or 3 years because they're trying to develop in certain areas, and they've been very, very successful. You'll notice as well that members are starting to rotate a bit as well. Okay, that their members are rotating from industry. I think it still does need to be there to some extent too, because I think the IFRS Foundation and the CSRD will need to feed off it a little bit. But remember as well, I can't underestimate too that in the interviewing I've done, there are also concerns about this influence that I'm talking about. That there is a sense it may be too much.
Very good. Thank you so much, Brendan, for this.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the invitation.
That's super interesting, and much appreciated that you take your time and do this. And hope you will get well soon. I heard you had some football accidents over there in Amsterdam.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.